Okay, camera basics, aka manual mode on your camera. It can be scary, can be terrifying. When I first started, I was just like, yeah, I totally took that picture like that on purpose. Actually, I had no idea what I was doing. But now I do, and I would like to tell you how to do it too. When it comes to using manual mode on your camera, there's 3 things you have to control in order to get a beautiful image. They're what I like to call the exposure triangle. And that is the shutter speed, aperture, and ISO of your image. Let's talk about the first one, shutter speed. This basically controls the speed at which the shutter opens and closes, thus the duration that your sensor is exposed to light. Shutter speed is measured in fractions of a second. So it could be a whole second, half of a second, 1/50th of a second, or 1/4000th of a second. So this setting controls 2 things. The first one is motion blur. If you capture the motion of something at 1/320th of a second, you're pretty much going to freeze that thing in that particular moment. But if you open your sensor for, let's say, 1/50th of a second or 1/24th of a second, then you're going to capture a little bit more motion in your image. Now you might be doing this intentionally, but if you're not, you might get a blurry image, and that's not something you always want. The other thing shutter speed controls is basically how much light your sensor is getting. The faster the shutter speed, the less light is able to make it to the sensor, and thus the darker your image. So because shutter speed controls the brightness of the image, you might want to sometimes compensate for the lack of light, and you can do this with ISO. ISO stands for International Standardization Organization, but it doesn't matter. You just need to think of it as the sensor's sensitivity to light. So the higher the number, the more sensitive your sensor is. Generally speaking, you want to shoot with your ISO as low as possible while still exposing the image properly. If your ISO is high to compensate for the lack of available light, you're going to notice noise and artifacting that deteriorate the quality of your image. I forgot to unplug the fridge. God damn it. Now you know one way to compensate for the lack of available light by increasing your shutter speed, and that's increasing your ISO. Cameras have something called a native ISO, which you can just quickly Google for whatever camera model you have. Generally, if you stick to that number, the sensor will produce the cleanest image possible. The last part of the exposure triangle is called aperture, and this is actually a property of the lens, not the camera. The aperture basically describes the opening of the lens. The wider the opening, the more light comes in, and the smaller, the less light comes in. The aperture is measured in f-stops for photography lenses or t-stops for cinema lenses. It's a little counterintuitive, but the lower the f-stop or t-stop, the wider the opening of the lens. And this controls 2 things. The first one being the plane of focus, or what part of the image is in focus and what part is not. When the lens is wide open, it produces a shallow depth of field, which means that the plane of focus becomes narrower and narrower. Let's take this composition for example. I am in focus, whereas the background is not. And you can see that I can make something go in and out of focus just by moving it in and out of the focus plane. This happens when the lens is wide open. But if I wanted to make the entire image be in focus, I would have to stop down the lens or close down the opening. Now this does 2 things. It makes more things appear to be in focus, but at the same time lets less light into the camera. But you can compensate by changing your shutter speed or your ISO. Here's an example of an image where the subject is in focus and the background is not. And here's an example of the subject and the background both being in the focus plane. And I did this just by changing the aperture and the shutter speed of my camera. So there you have it. That's how you can control the exposure of your image using manual mode. So go out there and experiment. Try to capture fast-moving objects with a high shutter speed and freeze them in time, or try to capture a busy street with a little bit more motion blur. Choose what story you tell by deciding what's in focus and what's out of focus, and wrestle with your ISO to keep it as low as possible. You can always add noise in post, but you can't really remove noise if it's already there. So there you have it, the exposure triangle for manual mode in your camera. Now this isn't everything you need to know about taking a picture in manual mode, but I plan on releasing a second video that explain some other things that you should keep an eye out for. I hope you found this useful. If you did, please let me know in the comments, or let me know if you have any other questions about your camera, and I'll try to answer them, maybe with another video. So like, subscribe, and until then, keep creating and stay safe.